describe about electricity, so on and so forth. So I did not ask for the objective nature of pencil. I said, I'm giving you 1 minute or probably 2 minutes. Look at this pencil and think about all those feelings that come to your mind. And I got, because there was just 6 to 7 students in class, and I got a varied responses. Students said, some of them said, well, it is very much like you can erase off. A pencil allows you to erase off your past mistakes and write your own story, or give you a narration of your own life in your own way. Someone said pencil for me is nothing but optimism. It is very optimistic for me. Whatever errors or mistakes I've done in past, it always allows me to look forward, to look ahead, and not to repeat those mistakes again. And that's how those 5 to 6 students started to describe the word pencil, what it meant to them, very subjectively. So this is where Mr. Wordsworth is trying to say, that's what he's trying to say. When you're taking up the poetic subject, it should be, first of all, taken up from the situation, circumstances, and environment of the common life. And second, it should be really in a language used by men that is closer to colloquial language. But I don't say that it should be a prose line or it should be just a colloquial line. It should be colored with imagination in such a manner that the ordinary thing that comes to your mind when you look at that particular object, the moment the poet, when he describes it, the unusual part is brought up. What he means is simply that normal, very ordinary object that you know, that you see, and some thoughts come to your mind objectively, those objective thoughts, or those thoughts which are very rational in nature, that should not become the part of your poetic passion. That has nothing to do with your poetic passion. Rather, your poetic passion should come up in a way that something unusual should be presented to the mind of that ordinary object, right? So what he's trying to say is that basically poetic passion works at 2 levels. One is at the human, at the ordinary level. So for example, and I gave this as an example to the class in both the sections. You go downstairs, and I was mentioning about the particular area in our institute where there's a lot of gardening and there's a lot of flowers that are planted, and the way they have been taken care of in their full bloom, what we see them, how we perceive them. So when you go there and look at those flowers at that garden, first is the very human or ordinary emotion that will come to your heart, how a child expresses the very primordial sort of emotions that arises, how beautiful it is. It's such a pleasing thing to look at. It is such a pleasing thing for those 5 senses of human beings, right? That is at the very basic level, at the very child level, ordinary level. So one is when you're describing of the poetic passion, Wordsworth says they function at 2 levels. One is at the human or ordinary level, and second is at the meditative or imaginative level. And what is this imaginative or meditative level? When I gave this example of flowers in full bloom in the garden, and I said that come upstairs the very next day, think about that flower, and you have to compose 3 or 4 lines, a stanza of just 3 or 4 lines. What I meant by that exercise was, now that you have taken some time, now during your meditation of it, now by meditation I do not mean that you sit in a particular manner with your hands and fingers stretched out and the way it is expected on a spiritual path, you sit in meditation. No. In meditation is simply by way of contemplation. So very next day when you come upstairs and when you think about the flower in contemplation, that is something when you're contemplating about that particular flower, when you're meditating on that flower, those emotions should be expressed in such a manner that a kind of symbolic property, a kind of symbolic infusion should be thought of, and then it should be used or written down in language. A kind of symbolic property, a kind of symbolic infusion should be thought of, and then it should be used or written down in language. So if I repeat it, poetic passion works at two levels. As per Wordsworth, poetic passion works at two levels. One is human or ordinary. Second is meditative or imaginative. Human or ordinary simply means that object, or if you remember, we took the example of the flower. That object, it affects us by the power of its own. The fact that it's purple in color, the fact that it pleases me, it pleases my eyes, the fact that it gives a great smell, or a kind of whatever smell that comes out, whether you like it or you do not like it. So it's always not a necessary thing that you'll find these smells to be appealing one, right? So those objects which affect us by the power of their own at the very primordial or basic level. Second poetic part of the poetic passion is meditative or imaginative. Now this means when these objects, they affect us by symbolic properties, or they affect us symbolic properties when meditatively infused, right? Now, if we get back to our original example of the pencil, yes, when the students gave me those subjective ideas of what a pencil is, I was quite impressed by when they said that it stands as an optimistic object for me, that I can look for the better things in future and erasing all the past mistakes. So this was something different for me, although not unknown. I was not unbeknownst to this, but yes, it was not a very mundane explanation. It was not just an ordinary one. It was certainly to an extent it was extraordinary. But again, not a very novel one, but yes, extraordinary in a sense. And this is where he says, let's give it a reading once again. That is, let's continue from the text. The principal object, so I'll skip up the few lines that exist between, that are stopped by the way of commas or additional lines or some kind of approximation to the first clause of a sentence, right? So I'll speak up only or chart out only the important lines. The principal object which I proposed to myself in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them in a selection of language really used by men, but at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual way. And further and above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting. How to make them interesting? By tracing in them, by finding out in them, by locating or charting in them the true primary laws of our nature. And what does this mean? True primary laws of our nature? That is the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. That is, here he is referring to the imaginative or meditative part of poetic passion. He says that apart from the use of imagination, apart from these incidents and situations presented in an unusual way, it should be made, these incidents and situations should be made interesting in such a manner that they become truly one with the primary laws of our nature, that they become closest to how nature have described them. They become one with how primary laws of nature have given to them, the power that the nature has given to them, or the description that the nature has given to them. And how do we do that? By in the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. By this it means that by looking for the best symbolic properties which are also meditatively infused. Okay, so let's proceed further, and I continue from where we left last time. That is from the same paragraph 2-3 lines ahead. Low and rustic life was generally chosen because, in that condition, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, and they are less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because, in that condition of life, our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated, because the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupations, and which are more easily comprehended, are more durable, and lastly, because in that conditions the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Now, before we proceed further, we have seen in the previous lines he talked of the selection of language really used by men and choosing people and incidents and situations from common life. So, apart from that neoclassical, the dimension of neoclassicism that we have been repeating in the past classes too, there was another element to this explanation, and that was to this association, and that was it was the French Revolution that brought this new philosophy of rights of all men. That is, that all men are equal, or the rights of men, or the rights of justice, of fraternity, so on and so forth, right? And this was quite blatant and quite palpable in politics and literature too. Now, this meant that the ideals of equality, fraternity, liberty, all men are equal, so on and so forth, the dignity of the individual spirit, they can be formed. It was also suggested and seen that why can't they be the form of one's artistic subject, or for that matter, the poetic subject? So this was questioned in the first place. So when Wordsworth asserted in his preface that he deliberately chose to represent incidents and situations from common life, quote unquote, incidents and situations from common life, here he translated somewhere his own democratic sympathies into the critical terms. He justified the use of peasants, the use of children, the use of outcasts, criminals, mad women, mad men, as to be the serious subjects, or can be made the serious subjects of poetic or even tragic concern. Then he says that it should be in a selection of language really used by men. Again, this was on the ground that there is no essential difference between language of prose and metrical composition. This is again what Mr. Wordsworth has said, that he believed that there was no essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. And while he was making this claim, he was somewhere, of course, very obviously attacking the neoclassical principles, something that required the language, and in many kinds of poems, to be elevated over the everyday speech, to be higher over the everyday speech by a more special, a more refined, a more dignified diction and artful images and figures of speeches, right? So Wordsworth somewhere emphasized the poetry of sincerity is more important than the poetry of artifice, expressed in the ordinary language of its time. Now let's come down to this when he says that low and this rustic life was generally chosen, or it is ideally chosen, because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, right? Or they are under less restraint. What do we mean by this less restraint? Or they speak a plainer or more emphatic language. What do we mean by it? So here he means that a rustic life in a countryside, it will first of all, now think of certain words when it comes to your mind when I say rustic life, a life in the countryside, a life in a village, right? A life full of rusticity or rustic life. Now, first of all, the few of the thoughts that comes to someone's mind would be that the life that you're talking of, someone's life, which would be raw, which will be unpolished, right? Which will be unrefined, but not insincere, but not very hollow, right? But not very contrived or gaudy. That means you're describing that you're closer to your real self, you're closer to your genuine self, you're closer to your unembellished self, right? So, the essential nature of humanity, it always finds a more congenial soil to grow and express itself more naturally in a rustic time or in a rustic or countryside life. So, rural settings or the rustic life. Now, again, this is a very romantic notion of a rural and rustic life. Why? Because rural settings certainly represent a kind of pastoral ideal of an ordered or an harmonious or a peaceful society. But rural settings or rural life can also be about poverty. Rural settings can also be about lack of resources.